Hey everyone, and welcome. My name is Haiyang. I'm a senior data scientist at KPMG Ignition Tokyo. Welcome to XAI, Learning Fairness with Interpretable Machine Learning. This event is co-hosted by deeplearning.ai, KPMG Ignition Tokyo, and Machine Learning Tokyo. KPMG Ignition Tokyo is a technological hub of KPMG Japan. It develops common digital platform technologies for KPMG's audit, tax, and advisory service lines, while also supporting the digital transformation of KPMG Japan and our clients. And Machine Learning Tokyo is an award-winning nonprofit organization dedicated to democratizing machine learning through open education, open source, and open science. I'm so excited to be here today, facilitating the event, representing such international AI community. Today, we are honored to have two guest speakers. Our first speaker is Tim Denley. He's a director of board and chief solutions officer at KPMG Ignition Tokyo. Tim will be giving us a talk on KPMG's view on trends in business adoption of AI and ethical concerns, along with our effort at KPMG Ignition Tokyo. Our second speaker is Serg Masis. He's the author of Interpretable Machine Learning with Python, and he's a climate and agronomic data scientist at Syngenta. Serg will be giving us a presentation on an overview of many methods employed to detect and mitigate bias and place guardrails to ensure fairness. We will follow with a Q&A session afterwards. Here's a reminder for all our audience today. If you'd like to pose a question for our speakers or upvote others, please find the link to Slido in our YouTube discussion box or in the event reminder email we sent to you. And now, without further ado, let us welcome our first speaker, Tim Denley. Hey, Tim, please feel free to take it away.
Thanks, Haiyang. Thanks, everybody, for giving me an opportunity to talk to you today about some of the things that we're doing at KPMG and some of our thoughts on, particularly around ethics in AI. And what I'd like to do is give everybody a bit of a sense of what business leaders are thinking about in terms of AI and ethics in AI. I'm not going to go into a lot of technical details, and I'll leave the technical stuff to Serg, who knows much more than I do. But I did want to make sure that we give people that context of the challenge that executives are facing in terms of dealing with AI and these new technologies. So let me share my screen here and start to walk through some of this. So first, let me give a quick introduction to my team at KPMG Ignition Tokyo. So as Haiyang mentioned, we're a team that are focused on helping to transform our own business in order to help transform our clients' businesses. So we have a team of around 130 technologists, data scientists, software engineers, and we're really focused on helping to drive those latest technologies from Horizon 2 and 3 into our business today. We do this across a number of different things. We obviously have a foundation in technology, but we're also building technology platforms which help our business practitioners to bring their business acumen and their business skills in together with that technology to enhance what we're doing. We're really shifting from professional services based on humans alone to professionals as a service using technology as a way to augment and enhance the ability of our technologists to provide that business service. We've been working really closely over the last few years with Machine Learning Tokyo, and I think it's a really good partnership in that we've got some interesting knowledge that we can bring to the table in terms of business and what's happening, and we're really enjoying working with the network of technologists around the world. So I'm going to start off and say that 2021 is really shaping to be this unprecedented leap of AI into the mainstream. And I want to try and give a little bit of perspective across the time frame, looking at what I'm seeing in terms of changes in the business context around AI. If I go all the way back to 2017, we surveyed a number of C-level executives, and what we saw was that a lot of business executives were worried about what data and analytics and AI and these new technologies would do to their reputation. So there was a perception of risk and challenge there, but also that there was a high level of expectation that these new technologies would make a big difference in businesses. At the same time, we surveyed a number of internal auditors, and what we discovered was that very few were confident in the governance that was in place around AI. And I think we're now only now starting to see the evolution of that and the direct drive and need for regulation around AI. If I fast forward into 2020, with the COVID pandemic around the world, there was a lot of change and evolution in the executive mindset and mandate around AI. The biggest thing was that everybody was beginning to see AI as a way to make their organizations more efficient. And again, increasingly more and more people were thinking that machine learning was the thing that was the biggest impact. At the same time, continuing the trend of most companies realizing and understanding that ethics in AI were absolutely necessary, but very few, less than half, had actually implemented anything around a code of ethics for AI. The other key thing is that we were seeing increasingly more business leaders saying that they wanted and expected the government to be involved in regulating AI technology. So many companies are continuing to build on their R&D and reskilling their employees to be able to leverage and use AI. But that still lingering worry of how do you actually make sure that you've got the right governance and control around the AI that you're implementing. The lack of quality in data and the challenges that many organizations, and I'm sure many of you have seen this in the organizations that you work with, really difficult kind of challenges around how to manage and build that quality in data. So moving on to 2021, with the really rapid ramp up of usage of AI in terms of building efficiencies in businesses during the pandemic, we're seeing kind of a doubling down on AI, and I think that when I look at these numbers across a number of different industries, we're absolutely starting to see the shift from this very limited pilot capacity to being functional and even being described as fully functional and at scale in operational context for AI across a number of different industries. However, the perception and the pace of adoption is still quite different across industries, and there is still a perception in many cases that the adoption and usage of AI is proceeding faster than it probably should. So again, bringing back into question those things around the governance and the ethics of AI. Certainly COVID-19 made a huge difference in terms of implementation and accelerated significantly most organizations' ramp up and usage of AI. However, the confidence levels are growing, but still not at the level where all executives are completely confident in their ability to leverage and completely trust AI. So that lack of confidence is still there. We see two really critical risks that raise up when we talk to executives about this. The first is cybersecurity breaches, and the second is privacy violations. So that should help give you a bit of context around where organizations are most concerned about the way that they're implementing AI. Now, what I find really interesting about this is that it's not necessarily about ethics. It's fairly traditional understanding of where the risks sit. So I think that we will continue to see and experience that evolution of understanding beyond just the very obvious cybersecurity and privacy aspects. However, there is definitely an understanding that those ethical concerns are going to continue to grow, and looking at a number of different industries where we would expect to see that is absolutely growing and changing over time. So one of the really interesting things that when we talked to industries about this was that smaller and medium businesses are far more likely to say that they have a code of ethics than large companies. And I think this represents, certainly in our experience as KPMG, when we work with very large organizations, the larger the organization, the harder it is to find ways to actually implement ethical standards. It's relatively easy and there's well-established approaches around how to implement compliance and governance standards, but ethics gets into a number of different areas that are harder to judge and then control. The other challenge that I think most executives face, and it's very much represented in this question, was the ability for an organization to keep up with the evolving changes in the AI landscape, and we see a overwhelming majority saying that they are struggling to keep up with and finding it hard to keep up with the landscape of AI. The other thing is this challenge of selecting the right AI technologies, and we often in a business context talk about AI as this broad-reaching statement that covers everything, but we all know that AI actually encompasses many different types of technologies and approaches to solving problems, and businesses really struggle with wrapping their head around the technology nuances of what those different approaches mean, and how they can actually implement those within their business context. So with all of that as context, what I'll say is business leaders are struggling to understand this, and business leaders see incredible challenges in terms of ethics in, I think, the same way that our technical members within organizations are seeing. But there's still not a huge amount of concrete approaches to control and manage and build on those governance constructs. So a couple of key things that we focus on when we talk about ethics and AI and how you implement. The first one is integrity, ensuring that the lineage and appropriateness of how data is used, as well as the genesis of the data itself. Making sure that you have explainability. Transparency throughout the process, and ensuring that the decision-making process is then articulated in ways that the business can understand. Naturally, fairness, ethical, free of bias, free from prejudice, and I know Serg will talk a little bit more about technically how some of the ways in which we can do that. And then, of course, robustness and resilience in terms of the agility and the compliance that needs to be able to put in place around resistance against bad actors. We have created what we call AI in control, which is a framework around building some of those transparency constructs. And certainly what we've discovered is that when we're able to help the business executives have more confidence through the transparency and frameworks, we're actually enabling the technology teams to be able to move quicker and to be able to move into more advanced technologies. And in that context, I won't go through a lot of the details of what KPMG does. I think that's relatively straightforward. But certainly within KPMG Ignition Tokyo, one of the key things that we've done is made sure that our focus is not just business. It's making sure that technology across the different pillars of technologies that make sense and are appropriate for a professional services organization are backed up with the technologists required to actually help the executives move through that. So I think that there is a huge amount of potential, and there's a huge amount of expectation being built up in terms of executive viewpoint on the usage of AI and these new technologies. And I'm excited to see how we can leverage our ability as technologists to build on and to enhance our various mechanisms to be able to support and help our management to wrap their heads around this new and evolving world of AI. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to put some business context on this, and I hope that was helpful. We'll share the slides for everybody so that they can look through some of those details and dig into some of the specifics if they're interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I totally agree both business and technology side can work together for better explainability and fairness. Okay, so for our audience, if you have any questions for Tim, again, you can find the link to Slido to post your questions in the YouTube discussion box or in your email reminder email, that the event reminder email that we sent to you, okay? So we will be answering those questions after the second presentation, okay? Thank you. Now let's welcome our keynote speaker today, Serg Masis. Welcome, Serg. The stage is yours. Please take it away.
Greetings from Chicago, and I'll be sharing my slides now. So as soon as I share my slides, make sure you put them on. All right. This is my presentation on XAI, learning fairness with interpretable machine learning. First, I'm going to explain what the session is about. It's broken into 5 parts. First, we have a brief overview of explainable AI and interpretable machine learning. Then we discuss what fairness is and the origin of bias, followed by the parts about detecting and mitigating bias, which is like the meat of the whole presentation. Lastly, I speculate on what's in store for machine learning and its connection to fairness. Many of the questions asked by attendees when signing up led me to believe that I should start off with what exactly is explainable AI and interpretable machine learning and how it relates to fairness. There seems to be some confusion here, so I added this section to clarify that. So the first thing to know about these terms is that they are the same thing. One stems from academia and another more from industry, but they're used interchangeably. I prefer the term interpretable machine learning, so I'll be using this term more throughout this presentation. The second thing to know is that they have become increasingly more popular over the last 5 years, as evidenced by these Google trends. Although relatively new in the public domain, these terms have been long present in academic literature. Likewise, during the same period, there has been more and more mentions in books for both terms. However, the vast majority of these books have been either non-technical books for business audience, books about AI ethics for ethicists, sociologists, psychologists, etc., or academic compilations for researchers on ML and so on. Practitioner-oriented books on the subject have been scarce all these years. My book, published only 3 months ago, was the 3rd one. Thankfully, by mid-2020, there'll be 6 more books on the subject. So definitely there's more buzz about this topic. So what exactly is interpretable machine learning? The main concepts are fairness, accountability, and transparency, or FAT. You expect the machine learning model to produce fair predictions. They must be robust and traceable back to something or someone, and you should be able to understand how they were made. There are many concerns associated to this concept grounded in ethics. And ultimately, what we want to know is, can we trust the model? So all these concepts, they just relate to trust. Trust is mission critical. So it's fair to ask, is interpretable machine learning and ethical AI the same thing? Not really, but both concepts overlap. Ethical AI, also known as responsible machine learning, encompasses more than interpretable machine learning because it includes data and algorithmic governance aspects. These aspects include privacy regulations, data management procedures, and even modeling standards. They also uphold FAT. On the other hand, interpretable machine learning is how we can implement FAT with machine learning. However, these very same tools used for ethical reasons can be used with no ethical reasons in mind, simply for curiosity. They can also be used unethically too. An example is like adversarial robustness tools to verify robustness against adversaries can be used for people for nefarious reasons to actually see how they can conduct an attack. So I said trust is mission critical. But when you trust something, you're trusting it to fulfill a purpose. So I ask, what is the mission of AI? Why do we do all of this? The answer, in my humble opinion, is to enhance or replace human decision making. It's that simple. Those are tall orders, but hopefully not in a bad way, which is why we have to evaluate both options. The both options I'm talking about are human versus model decision making. On one hand, we have a human that carefully takes all these many steps to make a decision, right? But this is what Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman calls system 2 thinking or slow thinking. In reality, most of human decision making is system 1 thinking or fast thinking, and it's very biased, and it can often lead to unfair decisions. On the other hand, we have the model. When we discuss machine learning model decisions, we generally focus on the very last step. Inference is when the model has already been deployed and is being used in real-world applications. However, decisions were made before that, not by the model, but by a human. And because of this, there's potential for bias in every prior step. Remember what I said about fast decision making. What part of the problem to focus on, what data to use, and the bias that carries, how to prepare the data, what model classes to use, what evaluation metrics to use, and how to deploy the model. These are many untraceable decisions that were made before and not communicated or even understood, and they create what is called an accountability gap, which may lead to unfair outcomes. To sum things up, both the model and human decision-making are complex and generally opaque, and both have their strengths we can complement and when we use to our advantage. Okay, so that concludes part 1. Now in part 2, I will talk about exactly what is fairness, define it, and the origin of bias. So what is fairness? There are 3 notions of fairness. There's treatment, there's process, and there's outcome. Unless robots are interacting directly with us, only the last 2 pertain to machine learning. First, there's outcomes. In other words, predictions being balanced from a statistical point of view. Then there's the question of having a fair process. Algorithmically, this may mean many things, but I prefer to see it as having no double standards. In other words, different rules applied to similar people. This is what is called a counterfactual notion of fairness. Fairness in practice for machine learning is often a balancing act between procedural and outcome fairness, since fair outcomes seldom come from equal procedures or even balanced procedures, but similar procedures lead to simpler and more intuitive explanations. So explainability and model complexity may be at odds with outcome fairness. And that's something we have to understand about when we were working with fairness. So why focus on fairness? When you hear explainable AI, what comes to mind is explainability and interpretability, which is on the base of this pyramid as transparency. As complicated as this may be, this base level in the pyramid is actually the low-hanging fruit. And the farther up you go, the harder it becomes, while less on top of mind for machine learning practitioners, and more important to the general public. In fact, most of the AI blunders we've seen over the last few years involve issues of fairness and privacy. They don't involve explainability and interpretability issues. So let's begin on the top of the pyramid, where unfairness is manifested as bias in the data and corresponding predictions. We won't be skipping any steps because the top layer depends on the 2 others. They have to, as a pyramid, it has to hold that layer up. So now, what is the origin of bias then? I've already made a hint as far as that concerned, that in supervised learning, we derive meaning and predictions from a model that's supposed to represent the truth. So in other words, if you see it from the model perspective, the model takes the data and the data represents the truth. Therefore, the prediction or whatever insight you take from the prediction coming from the model came from the data, which represents the truth. But the most fundamental problem we're aware about is bad data. Typically, data entry errors, random if we're lucky. However, there's also biases associated to bad data we should control for, and anomaly detection methods and comparing with external data sets for issues in distribution can help correct these issues. As for the truth, there's a whole host of issues. We have the ugly truths, all the prejudices and systemic biases that exist in the world and our data is merely depicting. We can make sure that our models mitigate them. Our models don't have to reflect the truth that exists. It can reflect the truth that we want. We can also we also have the fake truths, which are the many ways models can be purposely tricked, and also the truths that change over time. All these issues only aggravate the whole exercise. So lastly, we have our own biases with our models. Chief among them is observer bias, where we blind ourselves to what we assume or want to be true. Not all these biases lead to unfair outcomes and procedures, but they easily can. Having a data-driven approach to machine learning can go a long way in mitigating them. So often when we're talking about explainable AI, people point to complex models. It's easy to plane a complex black box model for bias, but a model, whether black box or not, only amplifies bias that already exists in the data. Therefore, detecting and mitigating bias should be primarily performed to the data and throughout the machine learning workflow to ensure that whatever remains of bias is not amplified. So before you mitigate bias, you have to detect it and measure it. And that's what we're going to discuss in part 3. Visualizations provide an easy way to detect bias. Firstly, you have when groups aren't fairly represented in a data set. This is a very common problem that can lead to bias in a model and can be easily visualized by counting how many samples exist for each group. However, it's naive to think that bias is purely representational. Even if you ensure parity between groups, bias may be still stored in the features and their distributions. For instance, the ground truth or predictions might show unfair disparities in outcomes between groups. These disparities can be visualized as you see here in this kind of chart, but they can also through other kind of plots like ROC plots, confusion matrices, and contour maps. You may also find troublesome interactions between features that lead to biased outcomes. You can visualize this at heat maps of interaction values or correlations between features. Later on, I'm going to show you an example of how this can be mitigated. Even if it's nice to visualize bias, it's best to quantify it with metrics that measure how well you are minimizing it. For instance, here we have 2 confusion matrices for 2 different groups. You can see that one suffers from much more false positives than another. In the context of this example, false positives is a bad thing. So it actually penalizes the group that has the highest false positives. So this could lead you to conclude that the underprivileged group is the one that has in this quadrant a higher number than the other. So this would be underprivileged, and likewise the other one would be the privileged one. From this, we can derive certain fairness. First, we have to discuss there are 3 kinds of fairness metrics. You have the group fairness metrics, you have individual fairness metrics, and you also have some hybrid fairness metrics. So like these that are derived from the confusion matrices make up these first ones you see here. And there are many more that you can be derived from these confusion matrices. We also have others that instead of measuring disparities between privileged and underprivileged groups, they do they do it with multiple protected attributes, such as race, age, and gender. This allows for intersectional notions of fairness, when the unfairness you're looking for is in the cross sections of these different groups. So then we have individual fairness metrics that are just pretty much any distance metric that can help you understand how far one data point is from another versus its outcomes. Then these very interesting hybrid ones, we have generalized entropy indices that can measure unfairness at a group, subgroup, and individual level, since they have a useful property called subgroup decomposability. The property guarantees that our unfairness measure over entire population can be decomposed as the sum of a between group fairness component. So that's a very interesting way of looking at it as well. So how do you choose among all these fairness metrics? You choose them. To choose them, you have to ask yourself many questions, as you can see in this decision tree, such as, is your model punitive or assistive? How unbalanced the labels are, and many others. It's not so simple. And even then, the metrics that you may find at the end of this decision tree may not be ideal given the nature of your data, such as you might find intersectionality, confounding variables, or biased ground truths. Another complication is interpreting the metrics and explaining them to stakeholders, because it's not always intuitive to explain. And as anybody have seen, these are derived from confusion matrices, and if you already presented to stakeholders that are non-technical a confusion matrix, you're going to see confused faces often. So then it's going to be complicated because of that. So another use case that's interesting is NLP. Natural language processing is interesting because given language reflects a cultural truth that by itself is biased, and it's not something that can be easily mitigated by balancing representations of groups or removing words. The most commonly studied manifestation in NLP of unfairness is gender bias, and there are many ways of measuring bias in text. With direct bias associations, you can measure how closer one word is to another versus another. For instance, here you can see that he is closer to physician, that she is closest to physician. There's an association there that exists in the language, and with analogies, you can find how well does the corporate exhibit other stereotypes. Like, for instance, you can relate he to football while she to volleyball or to softball. So lastly, you have indirect biases that are found through projections of neutral words. In other words, words that aren't inherently gendered in any way. So you can find these projections of softball with waitress, and since softball is related to she, that makes it gendered, indirectly. And then you have football that is related to businessmen. So here you can see a dynamic that is completely indirect. Also, NLP has several fairness visualizations to offer. You can plot the most biased terms associated to the words of interest. You can also cluster the most biased according to sentiment. As for metrics, there are many, but most famous of which is the word embedding association test, which measures how close one pair of biased words versus another pair of biased words. For instance, boy to business versus girl to arts. So you can measure that in this way. So lastly, we have to ask, what about images? In research, fairness for images has mostly focused on dataset balance issues and outcome disparities between groups using the following metrics. And these metrics are very common, and they're common in every use case. You can do them to any machine learning use case. If it's classification, you can do true positive rate, false positive rate, statistical parity difference, selection rate. You can do it to anyone. So there's nothing special about these. They're certainly useful, but this is disappointing because bias is carried in images in other more subtle ways. For instance, even if you have equal parts females and males in an image dataset, if more women are smiling than men, Does this mean that the model learns that women are more likely to smile? If women wear lipstick, does the model associate lipstick to women? Is that a harmful stereotype? There are many philosophical and ethical questions to answer here. And what's disappointing is that nobody's making those semantic associations. So here comes the fun part. Once you identify bias, how do we mitigate it? That's part 4. So bias can be mitigated at 3 different levels. We have the pre-processing level, which is directly to the data, the in-processing, which is during the training process, and then the post-processing, which is by modifying the predictions. There are many different methods for each of these levels, although many only work with tabular data and others only with text or NLP models. Each method could fill an entire presentation. So to keep things short, I will only go quickly 2 methods for each level, which are the ones that you see bolded here. So my first pre-processing method is balancing, also known as resampling. Is one of the most common bias mitigation methods, if not the most common. What you're doing is ensuring that it's a balanced representation of your groups and corresponding labels. Balance can mean many things. So sometimes it doesn't mean equal representation as it does here. The second pre-processing method I will display is reweighting. Typically, models learn from all samples equally. In other words, all samples have a weight of 1. However, it doesn't have to be like this. Many people don't know this, but many commonly used model classes have a parameter called sample weight, where you can modify the weights of each sample. You can then obtain new weights by a calibration process that ensures that they're on average still equal, but different. In the context of fairness, reweighting means to assign different weights to your samples during training so that outcomes are fair. For instance, the plot to the right shows average odds differences closer to 0 for most classification thresholds, while the one to the left shows a very fluctuating average odds difference. And now the first in-processing method I will discuss is called model constraints. And we'll see a variation, a few different kinds of model constraints here. And it's one of my my favorite bias mitigation methods. One of these kind of constraints is called monotonic constraints. You need these because data can be messy, so rules cannot be applied consistently. For instance, here we have some criminal recidivism data. Let's say we know that defendants have for defendants, priors per year tend to decrease with age. In other words, people as they go older, they commit less crimes. This is supported by a criminological domain knowledge. However, data is sparse here for older ager groups. While there are a number of high leverage data points that are contradicting domain knowledge, showing a few peaks in the function. So when you fit this function, when you fit the model, it learns that over here, it actually increases, when it should reality always go down despite what the data shows. So monotonic constraints forces a model to comply with this domain knowledge that priors per year will decrease monotonically with age. Another problem you can see here is that when you apply the model to unseen data, as you would expect to, what happens if the data has ages outside of the bounds of the training feature range? So here, like for instance, if you have ages that are above 68 or under 18, it's gonna think there's other trends other than there should be. So if you enforce monotonic constraints, it's always going to go down. So monotonic constraints can be applied in several ensemble decision tree libraries like XGBoost, like GBM, or CapBoost, as well as TensorFlow Lattice. So here you see this example has like GBM classifier. Monotonic constraints is actually one of several shape constraints that can be applied to a TensorFlow lattice model. If you want to force a curve or bump shape to a predictor response variable relationship, you can apply convexity or unimodality in TensorFlow lattice. And what if the domain knowledge you have is about a relationship between two predictors towards a response? Then you can use a bivariate constraint, like trust and dominance. Speaking of the relationships between multiple predictors and the outcome, what if you have reasons to suppress them? In this example, you have a heat map measuring interaction values, but you realize there's no reason sex and race to be interacting with priors per year or charge degree. Let's say you found all these interactions surrounded by the red to be troublesome. So with interaction constraints, you can place a fence around features that are allowed to play with each other, hence suppressing other interactions. In the plot to the right, you see how all the interactions outside of the green fences have been zeroed out, while on the plot to the left, you see they have some values. The second in processing bias mitigation method I will discuss is adversarial debiasing. Adversarial debiasing usually looks like this. There's two classifiers trained on the same data. One predicts your label, and another predicts a protected attribute. If you can accurately guess the protected attribute, then there's a bias. So the negative gradient serves to penalize the network when this happens. However, recently, there has also been alternative adversarial strategies for debiasing, such as using adversarial attacks to make models more robust, while at the same time debiasing, or also latent adversarial debiasing, which instead of mitigating bias towards specific groups or attributes, does it for collider bias, also known as sample selection. This bias is conducive to poor generalization, which makes it a very good option. So now let's see a couple of post-processing bias mitigation methods. The first one I'll discuss is called prediction abstention. I'm a big fan of this one, but sadly it's an obscure topic in academic research and virtually unknown in industry. Its premise is simple. Why does a model always have to make a prediction? Why can't it say, I don't know? This makes sense from a fairness point of view because low confidence decisions are typically the most unfair. For instance, you see in this chart over here, you see all the ones that are I don't know are in the neighborhood of this threshold. So everything between T0 and T1 is in the neighborhood of the threshold, the classification threshold, that is. So saying I don't know is one paper called punting. On the other hand, there's defer, which is the model knowing that it has less of a chance of predicting correctly than a human decision maker. So in that case, it defers to humans. But defer is offline since it doesn't get real-time feedback of outcomes. That's why we have online supervised learning. This can be even more powerful by letting a model know when it made a mistake and decide when to punt based on that. The second post-processing method I will mention is the last method overall, I promise, is equalized odds. And the concept is super simple. Find the classification threshold that equalizes predictive error for both privileged and underprivileged groups, and then use this threshold to make the predictions. In addition to equalized odds, there are many similar ways to do post-processing that involve finding an optimal classification threshold to satisfy one definition of fairness. There are also a few other methods that calibrate the scores instead. So there's a lot of ones in this kind of family of methods. Finally, part 4. What's next for machine learning? It's a 3-minute summary of what I think is the future of machine learning. So right now, we pilot machine learning with a surprisingly small amount of instruments. Then we wonder why models won't work in the worst conditions. But to make models that are always reliable and safe, we may need to use as many instruments as possible. Those instruments are a growing toolkit provided by interpretable machine learning. So what do we need to do to usher a new and fair era of piloting AI? The first thing we need to do is use those instruments. And once we do that, all machine learning will be interpretable machine learning. Right now, AutoML solutions don't incorporate interpretable machine learning seamlessly. But once they do, we ought to be using them, especially if they're no code or low code. This would make for an awesome cockpit to pilot machine learning. MLOps engineers are your mechanics. They will help you maintain the infrastructure to pilot machine learning. Embrace them. We also need to work with domain experts more, making the modeling exercise much more multidisciplinary than it is right now. This plays a larger part in mitigating bias. And then lastly, as new sensible standards and regulations come along, we need to champion them. And mind you, I said sensible. Speaking of regulations, there's a lot of AI strategies output over the last years by dozens of countries, as you can see in this chart by the UN. And sadly, few have become comprehensive laws. The most prominent is for the European Union. And while 2018's General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, does discuss many data and algorithmic trust issues, it's only highly applicable legally in privacy and data governance matters. And it's very vague about algorithmic transparency and discrimination and fairness. Hopefully, this will change over the next years. Despite the many hurdles, the future for machine learning is exciting. I believe, much like everyone and your grandmother can now create a website in an idiot-proof interface and deploy it with one click, models will be able to be trained and deployed just as easily in a few years. Soon enough, writing code to train models with Python will seem as quaint as writing HTML code to create websites. But before that happens, we have to tackle the interpretable machine learning pyramid. So with that, I end the presentation. Hopefully you learned something, and questions are welcome. You can easily reach me using any of my social media handles or through my website, serg.ai. So I'm good.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Serg, for the wonderful presentation. I learned a lot myself as well. Thank you very much. But I need to hand you over to take a look at the questions, So I hope all other audience, I hope you have enjoyed as much as I do. So I see there are a lot of questions over there. And so let me try to take a look at the questions list. And okay, Tim, I can see you. So probably we can start from Tim, because I can see there are some questions relevant to your talk. So I'm going to pick two questions that I think that probably you can answer together. The first one is from Pranav Leo. Okay, the question is should the responsibility for regulating AI be given to the governments, given they lag behind companies in terms of technology, or should it be with companies? Okay. And this is question number one, which is kind of related to the second one, I guess, is from Alireza Gordaizi. Okay, the question is that, Tim, among your clients who are aware of AI ethics, are there established industry-wide frameworks people are using to define their code, or it is more ad hoc? So Tim, could you please try to answer this question together? It's okay.
Both really good questions. So and Serg actually just touched a little bit on some of the specific regulations that we're seeing, but I think when we think about how regulations form and evolve over time, what we typically see is businesses lead the way and regulation catches up. And then once regulation catches up, it often goes too far. And then businesses fight to pull it back a little bit until we reach some level of equilibrium in terms of those regulations. So I expect that we will continue to see more and more businesses shaping the key areas around where regulation needs to be. And unfortunately, that's often going to happen with incidents. where we see negative things happen that then need to be regulated. And then the businesses and the regulators will find that equilibrium in the system. I do think that we're seeing this happen faster than we have in the past. And in that respect, to cover on kind of industries and what we're seeing in specific industries, I think that we're still very much in an ad hoc world when it comes to this. But what I can see is that there are certain industries that lend themselves better to finding ways to work together and with regulators to build that construct of control. For example, financial services and pharmaceuticals are two areas that have two industries that have very natural tendencies to work together with each other and with regulators to find ways to put in place the governance necessary. I would contrast that with, for example, telecommunications and media or consumer businesses that are less likely to work together to build those controlling constructs and governance. So I think that we're seeing in particular industries more tendencies to work together to solve these problems.
Great, thank you very much, team. Thank you. Okay, so let's move to some questions that I think maybe maybe Serg can provide more detailed explanation or answer to our audience, and then if there are further questions to team, and then we can go back again. Okay, thank you. So Serg, also I think there's a question from Machine Learning Tokyo. Actually, it's quite interesting. So let me take a look at here. It's from Alicia from Machine Learning Tokyo. The question is like, what kind of machine learning algorithms should be studied to make ML, machine learning, more explainable?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's entire families of algorithms that can be used for that. Typically, they're divided between model agnostic and model specific. They can have their benefit. Each one can have their benefits, their pros and cons depending on the scenario. There's also within each one there's subgroupings as well. Between the model agnostic ones, there's many that are permutation based. There's game theory based ones. If you're talking about deep learning, you have gradient based ones. I mean, there's a large subdivision of those. And I don't see why not study all of them, because we don't know yet which one is going to become the winner in terms of the one that everybody sees in 5 years as like the one that you must know, because that's eventually going to happen. And then down the pipeline, I'm seeing a lot having to do with counterfactuals. That's a family that's growing a lot, and I think it's very, very promising. A lot of techniques involving causal modeling and sensitivity analysis as well. So I'd study as many as you can, because, as I said, even one that doesn't look promising right now, it could evolve. Because the same way, when GradCam came out, a lot of people, oh, GradCam is the best. And then a lot of them derived from GradCam since then, GradCam++, EigenCam, and so on and so on and so on. So I'd study them, no matter what they are. I think it doesn't cost that much to learn, a little bit from everyone, and then, use that to inform yourself, for what happens, farther away in the future.
Thank you, Serg. So yes, we don't know which one's better, so let's try to learn as much as possible. Or we can try to build an AI, build a machine learning to learn from us, to tell us which one is the better. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Serg. So there will be second, talking about winner, right? As you mentioned just now. So there's another second question that's quite relevant to this one, actually. So the question is from, let me take a look, it's from Joss Yao. The question is, all data is biased because winners write the history. Today, many data is revised with new truths from old history. How do you deal with data drift?
No, yeah, that's a very interesting question. I'd say, well, the bias mitigation methods I discussed can go a long way in mitigating that, but There's also something to be said about experimenting, which is probably not done enough. Conducting experiments, like say you're a financial services company and you come up with these models based on data that you have a behavior from your customers right now, but that's already biased because of the way you conducted these, your business. And you didn't take the time to experiment and see, okay, what happens if I give, a certain amount, a small loan to everybody that asks for one, and see what happens. If they conducted that kind of, experiment, they might learn some things that will inform their future models. So there's a lot of approaches that can be done with experimentation, with causal modeling, that haven't been explored enough. And as far as like correcting past data, I mean, you can do that. You can do that by gathering external, unbiased data from, and massaging the data you have to follow the same distributions. And maybe even correcting some things that in your current data are biased. You realize, oh, I shouldn't have this column is garbage. I shouldn't use this because this is carrying a lot of bias. And you can do things like that to address these things.
Thank you, Serg. I mean, actually, in our daily work, and we try to do version control of the data as well. And I think this is similar to what you mentioned. It's like we try to record the change, the history of the change of the data systematically, and then we can monitor it to see like whether there's some artifact or whatever. And you can actually try to understand the mechanism of the change or whatever, right? So thank you very much.
But this is the person that asked the question talked about data drift, which is typically used for future data, but they also talked about past data. So I didn't answer that part because I figured, well, maybe they're talking about past data.
I got it. Yep. Thank you. Okay, since we have more time, and then actually I have a final question. I think that we can answer for both sides. So probably we can start from Tim first. So let me try to repeat the question and with the people who asked the question. So it's from Michelle Reynolds. So the question is, given, oh, I'm sorry, it's not this one. It's not the first one. It's not, okay, here's the question. It's like, what do the speakers see the best approach, top down or bottom up, to get large companies to adopt ethical AI? If they have to choose one, which one? And let's start from Tim. Okay, Tim, could you comment a little bit from company perspective?
You made it harder when you said I have to pick one. So I think that, to be honest, it depends on the organization. Some organizations will work better top down, and other organizations will work better bottom up. But as a business executive, I think I have to say top down. And at the end of the day, shareholders and company executives need to understand the impact and the potential risks to their organization by not having ethical AI in their systems. And the more they understand that, and the more they get ahead of that before they have incidences and issues, the more likely we are to enable the organization from the bottom up to truly be able to embrace that.
Yes, that's from executive perspective, right? Thank you very much. So let's try to hear from another perspective. Okay, from Serg. Okay, so when we try to build this SAI, probably we have a different perspective.
So, the same question. I think definitely I agree completely with Tim that it depends on the organization and also how informed the people that work in the bottom are as far as what are the ethical goals. Because if the people at the top know more about that than people at the bottom, then it doesn't really make sense to go the other way around. It's a cultural thing, I think.
And I mean, I'd add one more thing to this, that with the growth of the ESG agenda, and if I think back to Davos in 2020 and what we've seen in the evolution of ESG since, more and more the senior executives are being compelled to think about the efficacy of various aspects of their business, and this is one of those key areas.
Great. Thank you very much. Yes, I think that's quite clear. I hope that it answered the questions. Okay. Thank you. So time is up. So I think it's time for us to kind of wrap up this session. Thank you very much for your great questions. Okay, I wish we had more time to cover all of them because they are very great questions.
Yeah, there's some awesome questions. Yeah.
Right. And thank you, speaker, as well, for joining us today. Very wonderful presentations. So this brings us to the end of today's event. And we hope you have enjoyed today's event. And we are going to send you a follow-up email with a survey for all our attendees today. So we would love to hear from you, like to help us, like how we can make our future events better. So we look forward to see you again soon. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.